Hey Susie, happy Saturday. Wanted to get a video out to you finally. I've been trying to find a good space where I can record and have things be clear. So hopefully this works. I'm going to keep refining things, but definitely I have been wanting to get a video over to you. So what we'll do is I want to, real quick, I'm going to run through the concepts that we've been talking about and some of the things that are just the steps of the process for this functional range conditioning mobility work. So basically what we're doing is we through the assessment have found the biggest deficiencies and are starting to try to correct those out of the gate. So what we identified as hips, we already kind of knew some of this obviously with just where some of the pain's coming from, but hips and shoulders, and we've kind of honed in on hips, which is what I normally do. That's one of the bigger, more complicated muscle or joints. So it's a good place to start. So what we do is we are trying to identify where the tension is and to start kind of attacking that tension and seeing if we can restore some balance to the joint. So we have worked through a couple of different positions for you. We've done the lying on your back. We've done a kind of a modified sit. This is a pretty low uh, seat that I'm on here, but doing a modified sit for internal rotation. I do like this one. I think we ran into some issues with your knee on that setup. And so I think we actually ended up right back at 90-90. And so if you are good with 90-90, I like working in this position. Um, and so once we kind of find the position that works for us, where we are able to start to address the movement, in this case, external and internal rotation of the hip, then we start to seek out that tension, try to find the line of stretch in that joint. So a lot of times, just that forward lean is what's going to kind of get you there. We've talked a little bit, I think, about being able to explore the arc. As you rotate around, it obviously changes what's going on because what we're talking about is rotation of the femurs relative to the pelvis. And so the idea with this is you want to be able to work through this arc of motion until you find that greatest line of stretch. Once we find it, you're going to sit and do some passive stretching for about 2-ish minutes at a minimum. And this is where the breath really starts to come into play. This is actually, I think, a really interesting way to illustrate how the breath can really elicit some pretty dramatic changes physiologically pretty quickly. So what we want to do is find that stretch, and then we're going to start to breathe intentionally to bring ourselves more to kind of a parasympathetic state, the opposite of that fight or flight and tense state, to allow for some changes to happen in that joint. So trying to go nasal breath as much as we can, 4 seconds in, 8 seconds out, or just double the exhale to the inhale, or just exhale slowly. A lot of times as you kind of get more comfortable and you start to feel what's going on, the counting isn't as important as being able to get yourself to a certain state. But we want to find that line of stretch, and we're going to do our breath. And we've talked a little bit about, as we work into these joints, into these motions, we want to be trying to isolate certain areas as much as possible. So with something like this 90-90 position, as I come into a stretch into my front leg, I want to make sure that I'm not compensating through the spine and gaining myself more length than I generally have in the hip. That's the whole point, is we're trying to really zone in on the hip and elicit some change. So chest up, you want to think about pushing your butt back to find that stretch, and anywhere in the backside of the hip, um, kind of, it just depends. Everybody feels it differently. What I like to do though is when I kind of find the position of the hip that works for me, I like to get my arms out in front. It's kind of some kickstands so I can just kind of relax into it. This is where I'm going to do my double exhale to inhale nasal breathing. And often what will happen is as we start to really breathe intentionally, is we will start to feel the tension in that area release a little bit. And 2 minutes is important because 2 minutes is how long it takes the mechanisms in the muscle and as it sends signals to the brain to recognize that we are we're getting into a state where we are able to relax and release a little bit. So it's important that we don't rush through that process. But you want to keep kind of chasing that tension as you relax. Once after about 2 minutes, we're going to be at a good position to start doing some work. And so this is where our pails and rails come into play. Real quick, I'll run over those again as well. PAILS, progressive angular isometric loading. Rails is regressive angular isometric loading. So what the progressive side is going to be the side being stretched. And in this case here, it's my left, butt cheek up into my hip. That's going to be the progressive tissue. And it's essentially the tissue that is responsible for internal rotation. The regressive tissue is going to be the tissue up on the top side here that is going to be responsible for external rotation. And so the idea with this position is we're trying to improve external rotation. So PAILS is going to be trying to contract and activate the progressive tissue, the tissue being stretched, the backside here up into the hip. And then rails is going to be firing the regressive tissue. The regressive is the tissue that is being shortened in this position. In this case, it's going to be the tissue somewhere on the top of my leg. So once we find that in range, we've stretched, we start with the PAILS. So in that case, we're pushing down into the mat. And essentially you can think about if the mat wasn't there, if the floor wasn't there, my lower leg would be rotating under my knee. That is internal rotation. I'd be rotating my femur internally. So that's what I'm working on. Push, push, push. 10 to 12 seconds, every second getting harder, harder, harder. And then you will relax. And then we're going to fire our rails, go into our rails, which is the regressive tissue. There's a couple ways to think about this. Some people, it helps to think about the femur itself, that I am actually trying to externally rotate the femur more. Sometimes it's helpful to think about lifting the foot off the ground. Or you can think about using the muscles that are responsible for external rotation, the muscles I feel when I do this, and having those muscles pull me deeper into the stretch. So you can kind of turn the paradigm on its head here. Instead of the leg staying still, instead of the torso staying still and my leg moving towards the torso, my leg is staying still and my torso is moving towards the leg, but still active. This is a really important distinction to be able to make, active and passive. I don't want to just passively fall into a stretch. I want to pull myself into the stretch using this regressive tissue up top. So about a 10-second PAILS, 10-second rails. After that rails contraction, you should feel that increase the stretch while you're doing your rails. We have hopefully just found a little bit deeper end range position. We've opened up that motion just a touch. So now you want to resettle into the stretch, make sure that we're still in a good place up top. 30-ish seconds, back to the nasal breathing, just again to send the signal up to the brain that, hey, this is new, we're okay, right? And then we do another round. PAILS, push, 10, 9, 8, every second ramping up the contraction. This is where irradiation starts to come in. Tight through the shoulders, through the back, push, rest, rails. I am firing the regressive tissue, pulling myself deeper, feeling that increase the stretch. Relax, new end range. So 3 rounds of that that one is really about how much do we have to give. So if you find that within that first 1 or 2 PAILS and rails, we are getting to a fatigue, to a failure point, then we're good. That's why the intensity is important, because we've got to find that point of failure to encourage growth and strength to be built, growth of muscles and improving in strength. Once we have worked PAILS and rails, I'm not quite warmed up appropriately yet, so it's getting me a little bit. Then we can go into in-range control. And so what we then do is we find the very end range that we now have, which hopefully is a little more than when we started with our PAILS and rails and passive stretching. And then what we do in this situation is we want to remove the support and not allow the leg to fall. So we're going to challenge this muscle, this new in range. We're going to challenge ourselves to hold and own that position. So what that might look like in this 90-90 is we get deep. I'm going to then lean back and I try to bring the leg with me. Hold, hold. Imagine if someone's pushing in your foot here, do not let them move. Hold and return. Again, 10 seconds, 3 times. We're looking for about 30 seconds of time under tension total. That's going to be a passive range hold. Then we would go into an end range liftoff. So again, we're going to get through our passive range, back off a touch to allow ourselves a little room to work, and then we will actively try to pull away. So what we're doing is we're getting almost to our end range of motion, and we're challenging ourselves to initiate movement. And then the last step, well, actually there's 2 more steps, but the next step is what we call hovers. We've not done a ton of these yet, but essentially you're going to get to that close to that end range, and you're going to try to work, in this case, external rotation through a range of motion. That's going to be kind of end game for some of this stuff. So for right now, if you want to focus on the pails and rails, passive range holds, end range liftoffs, I think that's a fantastic place to start. I'll also say that this does not need to be this start to finish linear thing necessarily. So if you find that you are tight, if you find your hips are tight or any joint as you get to know this program, you can go right into some passive range hold, knowing now that we need at least 2 minutes and that utilizing our breath actually does a lot of good for us. You can do some gentle pails and rails just to tune into the joint and to start to increase some range of motion. If you've got time, you can do some passive range holds at the end. So feel free to be exploring these steps in these positions. Like I said, external in this 90-90 is our front leg, internal is the back leg. It's the same exact process. So we are now trying to feel some change happening in our joint here by this femur rotating internally relative to our pelvis. Pails is now here because now the progressive tissue, the tissue being stretched, is on the bottom side here. The regressive tissue that has been shortened with this internal rotation position is here. And something that might be helpful in this regard to understand this is that muscles never push. Muscles can only pull. So as we think about, as I do internal rotation, right, I try to lift this leg off the ground. It's not the tissue on the bottom that's pushing my leg up. It's the tissue up top that is shortening to pull. And so that might be a helpful thing to kind of understand as we talk about regressive and progressive tissue and position. But pails is going to be pushing down into the ground, push, push, push. Rails is going to be lifting up or actively pulling yourself around the corner. And so as you do this, you should feel this tissue kind of working. And again, by doing this active rails contraction, we are increasing the stretch. With this rotational work, the stretch really is in the hip capsule itself. So you might not feel like a certain muscle being stretched like you would maybe with a hamstring stretch. So just be aware that we are trying to elicit change at the deepest level, at the joint itself. And then you can follow the same process here with pails and rails, passive range holds, in-range liftoffs. Again, utilizing whatever of those you feel capable and needed in any given time, in any given moment. So that's going to be the 90-90 position. And I think we have talked about this already, that the positions are not terribly important. And so feel free to play around in different positions as you start to understand what hip internal rotation and external rotation is. There are many different ways to get into that position and to work in that position. Some of these positions are going to better serve you than others. And I think we've already experienced this a little bit. Certain positions, maybe there's some pain in different joints. We've got to be able to honor that and to that's the weakest link in the chain right now. So if we can find a way to work the hip without the knee having pain, that's very important. Last thing I'll say on this is that as you're working through this process with your hips or any joint in this these protocols, we want to come back to those cars as often as we can. So if I'm going to do something like a 90-90, and I'll switch just to kind of start to balance a little bit. If I'm going to be working in a 90-90 position on external rotation, and I go through my stretch, my pails, my rails, my holds, my liftoffs, whatever I'm doing that day, I then want to come back to my cars after I've run through those. And that's just going to help send some signals to my brain that this is now the range. So again, hopefully we've opened some range in this 10 to 15 minute thing, right, on the external rotation. So then when I get back to my cars, hopefully I have some improved, it's here actually, I have some improved motion, whatever I'm working, whether it's external, internal, whatever the motion is. So it's important to come back to those cars because that kind of communicates with the brain. This is now what this hip is capable of. And this is why cars are so valuable for daily practice, because it sends this signal every time you do it that, hey, I've got this whole range. This is what I'm doing. And we've talked about, the body and the brain will adapt to movement and it'll adapt to non-movement just as easily. So that's going to be an important aspect of this. So play around with that. Like I said, try some of these positions. I think we settled the last time we met on this 90-90 as the optimal one for you. So that's going to be your setup. And hopefully this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. If there's any issues, reach out. But otherwise, good luck.